Number 10 is it's based on white history. First of all, the bill states that more than 4 million Africans and their descendants were enslaved in the United States and the colonies that became the United States from 1619 to 1865, which excludes the descendants of Africans who were enslaved in America by anyone other than the English settlers who showed up half a century later. Showed up a century later. Europeans arrived on the continent with enslaved Africans. We still don't know what happened to the Africans who revolted in the Spanish colony of San Miguel.
It's Guadalupe.
I only speak English, y'all, so this isn't like me belittling nobody. I just never learned this language. All right, so this was in 1526. Historians speculate that they may be living in North Carolina, but are we to think that in 500 years, none of these people made it to California? It also rests.
Wait, hey, hold on. Before you go further,
Mhm.
What?
Ignorant.
Negro? This is stupid. First of all, this is stupid. First of all, California is California. Talking about in 500 years, none of those people made it to California. California is California. This is why state reparations bills cannot be the begin all end all. We already know that it has to be a federal reparations bill so you can pay everybody who is supposed to be included. But to be like, oh, well, you think for 500 years, it's not California's. California is not trying to repair all Black Americans in the country. California is trying to figure out how to do some type of repair for the people who are California residents. And they're still trying to see if they're going to do people who have moved out of California. So this already kind of seems like you're trying to throw out like a dumb argument. Like, I don't know, like it's a poisoning the well kind of thing, but it's just stupid. Like, who said that nobody made it from North Carolina to California in 500 years? Like, my people are from Arkansas and we've been in California since the 50s.
Well, I mean, beyond that, like within 500 years, they haven't mixed with the descendants of slaves, the English slaves, or even taking it even further. If we look at what California determined for the eligibility, they're just saying you had to be here before the 1900s. So that would include these motherfuckers. This is a non-argument.
You know who it wouldn't include, though? Me, because I'm not from California. None of my people are, and I'm okay with that.
Same.
Me too.
I don't feel left out of this. I support my people from California getting their reparations.
Thank you.
And I don't need a check. Not from y'all.
That's it. It's that easy. All right, let's keep going. I'm sorry. I just caught that part when he was like, you think nobody made it to California? I thought he was trying to do this as to talk about lineage based. It shouldn't be like it for federal reparations. But you're like arguing against the task force of California too? You sound like a goofball.
I thought he was smarter.
He is stupid. Continue.
All right, so it also rests on the tenuous definition of descendant and the actual definition of African American, which doesn't actually exist because race is just something white people made up.
Okay, stop. I'm sorry, y'all. Stop. Quit being like race is just something that white people made up. Yes, race is a social construct that has real life consequences. Our lineage / race had consequences for us. It still has consequences. Where you'd be like, oh, well, it's just some shit that white people made up. You pushing people into our lineage that are not our lineage is what white is you're basically flattening Blackness as if white people did. You can't do that. You don't get to erase us ethnically. So it's like it's something white people made up. That doesn't matter. Race is something that's made up, but ethnicity is ethnicity. Like, cultures are real. I don't understand why nobody understands that except when you start talking about Black people, nobody realizes that Black people have their own culture. Black Americans who descend from chattel slavery, we are not Africans. I'm sorry. Like, I've been spending time with my 85-year-old grandmother and my damn near 80-year-old great aunt. Like, they don't call themselves Africans. Right. They don't look at themselves as Africans. So how you gonna tell my elders that we all the same when they understand that a lot of these folks just got here like 30 years ago? Sorry, go ahead, y'all.
I'm trying to understand what exactly makes the definition of descendant tenuous. Like, what the fuck is he talking about? Like, you're either the descendant of people who went through this stuff or you're not. Like,
right.
That part is not even like something to argue about. Now, if he wants to talk about, race being a social construct, that's fine, but it still doesn't change the fact that the society used that construct against certain people during a certain time period. So therefore, we can still use that same concept for the people who went through that to actually be, more specific about these remedies. Other than that, I don't know what the fuck he's talking about.
I do. He says race is just something white people made up, and I agree, which is why we need lineage-based reparations. Race doesn't hold up to scrutiny.
Thank you for that kind introduction. My honor to be able to testify before you. I'm here to address one question. How to structure reparations in the way most likely to be upheld by the courts. My conclusion is that reparation is most likely to be upheld by the courts if it's structured in a race-neutral fashion. That is, it's most likely to be upheld by the courts if reparations are for those who were descendants of slaves rather than for all who are Black. In the United States, under current constitutional law, and in California under Proposition 209, laws that give a preference on the basis of race are either inherently suspect or perhaps per se illegal. And therefore the question is, how can reparations be structured in a way that would get through judicial review? Let me talk about two sources of law, the California Constitution and then the United States Constitution, to explain why I've come to this conclusion, then briefly respond to some of the questions that you might have about the position I'm taking, and then answer anything that you want to ask of me. The first source of law that you need to focus on is the California Constitution, what was commonly referred to as Proposition 209. It was called the California Civil Rights Initiative. It says that the state of California and all of its political subdivisions cannot discriminate or give preference on the basis of race in education, employment, or contracting. And so if reparations are given on the basis of race, that anyone who meets the definition of being Black is entitled to reparations because all have suffered from the legacy of slavery, I don't think it could survive a challenge under Proposition 209. Now, Proposition 209 is limited to education, contracting, and employment. And if the reparations were not in those areas, then Proposition 209 wouldn't be a problem. But if it's in education, or if it is in contracting, or if it is employment, then anything that is deemed as a preference on the basis of race is per se impermissible. This is different than what I'll talk about in a moment, the United States Constitution, where there is the possibility of racial preferences being constitutional. Under the California Constitution, they're not. There's relatively little case law about Proposition 209, but that which exists broadly defines what is preference. It would be hard to imagine that there'd be a reparation system that was racially defined that wouldn't run afoul of this. Now, as I said in my introduction, if this were defined as a benefit for those who are descendants of slaves, it would certainly largely overlap with race, but it would not entirely overlap with race. There are Blacks who are not descendants of slaves. There's a very small population that were enslaved that wouldn't be Blacks. So I think there'd be a strong argument based on Proposition 209 that limiting reparations to those who descendants of slaves would not run afoul of Prop 209, whereas if this is defined in a race-based manner, then I think Proposition 209 would be a substantial problem. But assume that Proposition 209 wasn't a problem. Imagine this wasn't reparation about education, contracting, and employment, in which case it would be entirely outside the scope of Proposition 209. There is still the United States Constitution. And the Supreme Court has said now, for over 30 years, that racial classifications benefiting minorities, just like racial classifications that disadvantage minorities, are highly suspect. The Supreme Court has said that racial classifications benefiting minorities, like those disadvantaging minorities, must meet strict scrutiny. As I'm sure the Commission knows, strict scrutiny means that the government action has to be necessary to achieve a compelling government purpose. And the Supreme Court has been very restrictive as to what counts as a compelling purpose in this context. Quite relevant to your Commission, the Supreme Court has said that remedying the history of past discrimination is not a compelling purpose sufficient to justify remedial action. There was a Supreme Court case, Wygant versus Jackson Board of Education. The Jackson, Michigan school system had recently hired a number of black teachers when it needed to have layoffs. It decided to fire white teachers with more seniority. Their argument was that this was to remedy a long history of race discrimination. They also said how important it was to provide role models for black children in the schools. The Supreme Court declared this unconstitutional, and the court's opinion was explicit that there cannot be preferences based on race on the grounds of remedying the history of discrimination. Or there's the case J. Croson versus City of Richmond. Richmond, Virginia, the capital of the old Confederacy, set aside 30% of its public works monies for minority-owned businesses. They did so because even though at that time Richmond was a city that was more than 50% black, racial minorities and blacks were receiving only about 1% of the public works contracts. But the Supreme Court declared this unconstitutional, and the court said the long history of race discrimination, including in Richmond, Virginia, didn't justify the preference that was given on the basis of race. There is, as of now, only one area where the United States Supreme Court has allowed race-conscious remedies, and that's in the area of higher education. In a series of cases, the Supreme Court has said that college universities have a compelling interest in a diverse student body, that college universities may use race as one factor among many in admissions decisions to enhance diversity to benefit minorities. This was initially articulated by Justice Lewis Powell in an opinion in Regents University of California versus Bakke in 1978. It was reaffirmed by the Supreme Court in 2003 in Grutter versus Bollinger, and then reaffirmed most frequently and recently in 2016 in Fisher versus Texas at Austin. But in the Fisher litigation, the Supreme Court made clear that college universities could use race as a factor in admissions decisions only if they could prove there was no other way to achieve diversity. Now, it's worth noting that the states can do what would be thought of as protecting more rights than the U.S. Constitution. And so California can prohibit affirmative action even though it would be permissible under the U.S. Constitution. That's exactly what Proposition 209 does. But even as to this one area where racial classifications benefit minority have been allowed, the law, I think, is about to change. The Supreme Court has granted review in two cases for next October, one involving Harvard University and one involving the University of North Carolina. And the issue in those two cases is whether the Supreme Court's going to overrule the earlier decisions allowing affirmative action. Why two cases? Well, the Constitution applies only to the government. Private activities don't have to comply with the Constitution. Harvard is a private university. But Title VI of the 1964 Civil Rights Act applies to entities that receive federal funds, including private entities. Harvard obviously receives federal funds. So the issue in the Harvard case is whether or not race-conscious affirmative action in admissions violates Title VI. And in the University of North Carolina case is whether it violates equal protection. It is impossible to count 5 votes on the current Supreme Court that would uphold the Harvard and the North Carolina affirmative action programs. Chief Justice John Roberts, been outspoken in his opposition to all forms of affirmative action. And parents involved in community schools for Seattle Schools Number 1, 2007, he explicitly took the position that the Constitution requires that the government be colorblind. Justice Thomas and Alito have taken the position, and with 3 additional conservative justices, Gorsuch, Kavanaugh, and Barrett, hard to imagine the Supreme Court doing anything but reversing those earlier decisions. Well, what does that mean in the context of the discussion of reparations? If reparations are framed in a race-based manner, then they would have to meet strict scrutiny, necessary to achieve a compelling purpose. And remember, the Supreme Court has said remedying a history of discrimination is not regarded by the court as a compelling government purpose. And so I think it would be very hard to convince this Supreme Court or lower courts following Supreme Court precedent that a race-based reparation program would be constitutional. I think the best hope with regard to the Supreme Court is a program that is facially race neutral, that being framed in terms of a benefit for descendants of slaves would be much more likely to be upheld. There are precedents for reparations, as this commission well knows. For example, there was the reparations provided to those who had been in Japanese internment camps. But it's important to note that that was based on people who had suffered a particular injury, and they were each given $20,000 in an apology during the Reagan administration. It wasn't anyone who was of a particular race. I think it would be hard to convince this court that a race-based program met strict scrutiny was constitutional. On the other hand, what's more encouraging to me that I cannot think of any instance where the Supreme Court has struck down a race-neutral law on the ground that it has a benefit or even a targeted benefit for minorities. As an example, some states have adopted admissions programs where they take top 10% of classes across the state. And this was undoubtedly adopted to benefit minorities, and it had the effect of benefiting minorities. And yet the Supreme Court, at least called dicta, has indicated that would be constitutional, even though the purpose, the effect would be to benefit minorities. So I come to you as the messenger. I am not defending the law as set out by the Supreme Court. It is certainly not the law as I would want it to be. And I completely understand the benefits with regard to praising reparations and framing it in terms of those who are Black. I am simply addressing the question, what is most likely to be held by the courts? Let me just respond to 3 things that might be in mind, and then I'll take your questions. One thing that might be in mind is there is a tremendous difficulty in proving that someone is a descendant of slaves. This will be very under-inclusive in that way. As this commission knows so well, records are incomplete. And so the cost of what I'm suggesting is that many who are deserving would not get benefits. And I think if you go in the direction of providing that those who are descendants of slaves would get reparations, how to deal with the incomplete records and the lack of documentation becomes very important. A second concern is articulated by the prior speaker, all Blacks in this country have suffered from the legacy of slavery. All should therefore be able to benefit from reparations. I think that is a compelling argument, but I don't think the United States Supreme Court would find that to be a compelling argument. If you look at the cases I mentioned, where the court says remedying the past history of discrimination is not a compelling interest, I don't see a way of persuading the current Supreme Court, that matter the lower courts, of that. And a final criticism of what I'm suggesting is that there's still the purpose of benefiting Blacks. The effect is still to benefit Blacks. Might a court not strike it down on that basis? And yes, I think that's a risk, even of a reparations law that's framed in terms of benefiting descendants of slaves, but I think it is far more likely to be upheld than a law that is framed just in terms of race. So again, wanted to address just one question for you: how to frame reparations in the way most likely to be upheld by the courts. And I'm glad to take any questions.
Mhm.
Race doesn't hold up to scrutiny.
No, and he proved that in his debate that he did with Marcel. But moving on.
And again, I must still align for Marcel in that debate, even though we have all used this one. But I heard he was beating Michael Harriot over the head with it. So
Yeah,
are
yeah,
you
he
saying
was.
that we should pay Jewish people who were not descendants of the Holocaust? Because it didn't work like that. Only people got that money were people who went through it or who were descendants of. They did not give it to all Jewish people.
I don't understand why they would even limit it to Jewish people. According to this argument, it doesn't make any sense. Race is just a thing white people made up. They should just give that money to everybody.
I mean, and it's kind of like it's white history to erase all other people that were, who went through harms by the Nazis, who did not actually receive reparations. But, it's hard to have these conversations because people aren't honest about like all the nuances of it. When it really went down, the people who were harmed the most and had a little bit of political will were able to get reparations accomplished for them. Other groups are still trying to fight the fight. I believe, is it like the Namibians?
Man muss auch sehen, dass man auch diese Menschen zum Beispiel,
some of them would chop off the prisoners' heads
die Häftlinge die Köpfe abgeschnitten haben und
and then throw the rest of their bodies in the water to feed the sharks.
Haifische gefuttert haben und so weiter, ja. Und das ist,
When I think about this history, it makes me sad
Geschichte fantasiere,
and bitter.
bin ich eigentlich traurig und sauer.
Israel Konarchika is the only Herero activist in Germany. 100 years since the end of German colonialism, the 71-year-old Namibian is calling for the German government to take responsibility.
We're just demanding three things: an apology, recognition of genocide, and reparations. If you break something, you have to fix it.
Everybody has to fight their own fight. I don't understand. Everybody understands this except for when it comes to us. The Japanese didn't sit here and fight for reparations for all Asian people. They didn't even fight for reparations for Japanese people who weren't in the camp. I mean, so it's just goofy.
And didn't it only go to Japanese Americans on top of that?
Yes, it did. Yes,
yeah.
it did.
So,
there was
they
like
even
Japanese
split them up. They even split them up by if we're citizens. So
yeah. I think that also people need to look at the Native American situation because each tribe had cut their own deals with the American government. It wasn't some bullshit that we're all Native, so we all experienced the same thing. And, that was not the deal. So everybody had to figure out their own thing. And that's what's going to happen with, Black people who have been here for decades upon decades upon decades. Like, all of us did not have the same experience. So, for our ethnic group, we're going to have one deal. For Haitian Americans that might have been around, they're going to have another deal. Y'all get it. Y'all get what I'm saying.
Yep. I totally agree.
All right, y'all ready for number 9?
Listening to Reset Race, you now tuned in to Reset Race. You're listening to Reset Race, you're now tuned in to Reset Race. Put them back on the grill again. We grilling them, put them back on the grill again. We grilling them, put them back on the grill again. We grilling them, back on the grill again. We grilling them, You're listening to Reset Race. ADOS need reparations to make America great. You're tuned in to Reset Race. We no longer starving while others eat off our plate. No. You're listening to Reset Race. We focused on our justice claim. We know what is at stake. You're tuned in to Reset Race. You'll find out who really about justice and really who fake. Lineage go back to US Southern plantations. Lineage, Jim Crow and mass incarceration. Redlining lynchings. We are old from this nation. You're not about justice if you ain't for reparations. MG the wise one. Cousin mother intellectual. Samantha bringing fire. Anti-black. We pressing you. No permanent friends and no permanent enemies. The backbone of the country. To win, you need our energy. You gon' see. Listening to Reset Race. You now tuned in to Reset Race. You're listening to Reset Race. You're now tuned in to Reset Race. Put them back on the grill again. We grilling them. Put them back on the grill again. We grilling them. Put them back on the grill again. We grilling them. Back on the grill again. We grilling them. You're listening to Reset Race. ADOS need reparations to make America great. You're tuned in to Reset Race. We no longer starving while others eat off our plate. No. You're listening to Reset Race. We focused on our justice claim. We know what is at stake. You're tuned in to Reset Race. You'll find out who really about justice and really who fake.
Until you do right by me, everything you think about is gonna crumble.
Join us on Patreon at www.patreon.com/Reset Race Network.
I just wanted to say that reparations is not your piece of the American pie.
Facts.
You are not welcome. This is Negro pie over here.
All we want is some coffee and a couple of slices of pie. Is that all right?
No, these are whites-only pies.
But do you have any Negro pies?
Hey, Claude, come on now. This woman ain't got